Do you have any vintage handwork at your house that you just don't know what to do with? I went through a phase where I bought a lot of vintage handwork, and this piece was in a frame. I'm showing you the pinholes and the mess, but we're going to trim that off. Today I'm going to show you how to use your vintage handwork pieces and make beautiful quilts. I found 2 charm packs to go with this one, and that's what we're going to use to make a quilt from it. These little pieces were cut out of linens, and they're just these antique darling. There were holes in part of the linens, and we're going to make a beautiful little something out of it. I'll show you later. This one, they're just quilt blocks that somebody put together and did applique and then embroidery on it. And when I bought this set of quilt blocks, there were a whole bunch that didn't have quite all of the embroidery finished. So I finished it, and now I can make a gorgeous quilt. It was fun to choose the fabric for these little tiny basket blocks. I picked a really fun, pretty floral and then some great borders. I want to lay them out and see what shape I want to make this quilt. I know I want it to be like a little doll quilt, or it could be used as a wall hanging. It depends what I decide to do with it. In the end, it could actually be a NICU quilt. I've put them on the cookie sheet because I like to have things mobile so I can transport them. This quilt went together so fast. I'm just cutting 4-inch squares to go with the 4-inch squares of the darling baskets, putting them in between. I do my little system where I number the rows and I pin them and get them ready, and then I'm ready to go to the sewing machine and sew them together. I sew them very carefully. I'm consistent with my seam allowance. That's what matters when you're doing this sort of work. And then, of course, I like to press. This is the part that people freak out and they're worried about. When I lay the quilt out, I just get my ruler out and measure and figure out how big I need my side triangles, and I just make it up. I use a ruler, and I never follow formulas online because I don't do math so well. So the important thing is I would prefer to have them bigger than smaller because I can always trim them. So I always make them a little too big. I do that on purpose. Sewing the seams, making sure they're budging together. Look how beautiful. On the edge of these little basket blocks, there's bias. And so I'm aware of that, and I'm being really careful. And when you cut these triangles after you figure it out and measure and do whatever you do, then what you do is make sure right there the bias is on the inside. So this seam I'm sewing next for these outside triangles will have bias on the inside, and that will sew up so that the corners aren't biased. So when I'm quilting the quilt later, it's to my advantage. And actually, when I put borders on, the less bias I have to deal with, the better. So right now I have bias and a little more bias, and I'll just carefully sew it together and it will all be fine. So when you have projects like this, just wing it and have confidence and strive and try, and all that can happen is you ruin a little fabric. Oh well, get brave. And here I am trimming off that extra too much of that first triangle. As this piece comes together, I realize the potential for this to be a wall hanging. And anytime you have a smaller piece, it's really important to square it. Make sure it's going to be square if it hangs on a wall. So I'm doing that as I trim. And then I audition the borders. These are going to be so beautiful. But I'll show you later because it's time to move on to this beautiful thing. This vintage handwork, I haven't trimmed it yet because I'm not sure how big I should trim it. So I'm laying the quilt out on my design floor, which, by the way, this quilt is so much more beautiful than it is in the picture. I think the design floor is stealing from the colors. It's the sweetest, best quilt. I sew and I decide 3 is the right amount. So I measure to know exactly how much that is, and it was perfectly at the size it should be. So now I'm trimming it down so that the center piece will be exactly 3 blocks on each side so that I can sew it right into the quilt. You mathematical people are so lucky because this is easy for you. But once I figured out to sew 3 blocks together, see how big they were, and square it up to that size, my life became enchanted. It's so easy because I just don't bother with math. I bother with sewing and then measuring and then doing it whatever size it is, and it works out brilliantly. Look how perfect this is going to be to sew together. So I lay it out. I just try to get the blocks even. This is everything but the kitchen sink charm packs from years ago, and I started, and you'll see there's 3 to the right and 2 to the left, because when you lay it out, you have to figure out the configuration. And I thought I'd add another one to the left, but as I get low on blocks, I think, no, that is not what I want to do. I'd rather have it elongated. So you see, I just stole that line off to the right and I put it underneath. And now I'm going to add borders to bring it up to size. I'll sew those on and show them to you shortly. Meanwhile, we get to play with these blocks, and they're so old looking in real life, so I decided to modernize them by choosing really fun, gorgeous modern fabric in the same color tones. I bet these blocks were made like in the 40s is my guess, or 50s. And now I'm going to make them look modern and wonderful with sashings, cornerstones, and borders. But first I need to trim them to size. Whenever I buy blocks that somebody else has made, I like to make sure they're accurate and of size, because when you buy other people's blocks, oftentimes they are crooked, and I want to sew with precision the best I can, and the best way to do that is to square blocks up. So every single one of these blocks is being squared up to the size that I picked. I don't even remember what that is, but whatever it is, it's a great square size, and here they are, all beautifully squared and ready to go. I have actually owned these blocks for over 20 years, and I'm so excited that it's almost their turn to be a quilt. I lay them on my design floor in a random floating pattern, so all the blocks are facing a different way, like they're falling, because, it's fall and they're leaves. And then I'm going to test my colors of sashing. And the sashing I chose, notice that there isn't a single blue block in these blocks, but this blue sets them off so beautifully. And as the quilt gets finished, it'll look like it's a blue quilt with these beautiful green cornerstones. And if you're interested in learning how to do cornerstones, let me know in the comments, and we could maybe do a video for you. This is our first quilt ready to be quilted, and I love how the balance works. It just is beautiful. And after I quilt it, I'm going to bind it in the floral, which is a very odd choice, I know, but it's going to be perfect for this quilt. The center baskets are bias, but they're going to quilt up so beautifully, and it's totally square. I can hardly wait to quilt it. This one is big enough to be a throw. The beautiful little borders I added just sets off the whole quilt, and I can see giving this at some point to someone who's having a really hard day, a woman friend, or someone in my church. I just really truly think this is a beautiful quilt. It would deliver plenty of love and comfort. Can you hear the gratitude from these blocks at your house? They are so happy that I put them into a quilt finally, and it's so modern and beautiful and will be so great on a bed. When you add modern fabrics to old fabric, it brings them to life and brings them to the modern day and age. Making these quilts has been so fun for me. I have more vintage handwork in the other room that I can hardly wait to get to. Your collection might not be as big as mine, but maybe you have something that your grandmother did or a favorite aunt. I hope that you will get it out and see what you can do with it. These are some pieces that I have, but I have more. So much fun waiting for me. Stay merry and creative.